So Dr. Aditi here. Today we're talking about bone basics. Now let me be quite clear, there's nothing basic about bone. It is quite complex and it's quite clever. It can do so many things that we're going to talk about today, but we are going to go over the anatomical features, the bone markings, also the histology, and compare spongy bone versus compact bone. So let's get started. Let's start with the anatomy of the bone. So whenever I'm thinking about the anatomy of the bone, I think of a house, right? It has hallways, corridors, and bedrooms. So just like a house, the long bone, which we're going to cover flat bone later, but long bone has something called the diaphysis, which is this long shaft, right? It's sort of like the hallway of a house. And this is going to be made of compact bone because we need it to be very strong and rigid to bear the weight of the body. And then you've got something called the epiphysis. So just like in a house, you have a hallway that widens and becomes a bedroom, for example. That's what happens here. The diaphysis is this narrow portion and it widens to become an epiphysis. And we're going to have the proximal, and we also have another one, which is the distal epiphysis. So we've got two on either end. So here's your hallway. You've got a bedroom here, and then you've got maybe a living room on the other end of the hallway. So the interesting thing about this, or the distinction here, is the epiphysis is made of spongy bone, right? Compact bone was the diaphysis, and spongy bone is what you find in the epiphysis, because this is where growth occurs. And this is where you're going to find red bone marrow, and hematopoiesis will occur also. Now, the next portion is the metaphysis. This is what I consider the meeting point. And so it's a nice way to remember metaphysis, because M for metaphysis and M for meeting point. This is where the diaphysis and epiphysis sort of connect together. Think of it like in a house, you could think of it like, a staircase connecting floors, or maybe like a short corridor. It just is a transition point or transition zone. Now, each epiphysis meets the diaphysis at the metaphysis. Say that 10 times, it's quite a mouthful. But here we have a narrow area that's called the epiphyseal plate. Now, you might be like, wait a minute, you just lined epiphyseal line, not plate. You're quite correct. Let me explain. The epiphyseal plate is actually a growth plate, and that's what you're going to see in children, because this is where growth occurs. The epiphyseal plate is a layer of hyaline cartilage, which is transparent, and you're going to see that very prominently in any x-ray you see of a child whose bones are still growing. However, when a child approaches the 18, 21 years of age, that's when bones stop growing. And the cartilage then is replaced by osseous tissue, and then this epiphyseal plate becomes an epiphyseal line, hence the distinction there. All right, then we've got the medullary cavity, which is like the basement of the house, right, where you store things. So the medullary cavity is a hollow space inside the diaphysis, and here we have yellow bone marrow that is stored there. So this is just a little overview of long bone and sort of an overview of anatomy. Let's take a look at the membranes. Okay, so here we have the medullary cavity, and we're going to look at the membranes. There's two membranes that you need to be aware of. They're very delicate membranous lining. The first one is the endosteum. Now think of the name. Endo, or end, means inside, osteo means bone. So it's going to be the inside lining of the bone. This is where bone growth, repair, and remodeling is going to occur. Now, the outer surface, on the other hand, is going to be very different. It has a very fibrous sort of membrane, and this is called the periosteum. Peri means around or surrounding, and osteum, as you know, means bone. So this is actually a little different in its function because it serves to nourish the bone. It contains blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, and sole purpose here is to take care of the bone and nourish it. But it also has a feature of providing an attachment point for tendons and ligaments. Now, the other thing to remember is the periosteum covers the entire outer surface of the bone, except where the epiphysis meets other bones, like a ball and socket joint, for example, right? In that region, we have something called articular cartilage, which you know is going to be your thin layer of cartilage that reduces friction and sort of acts like a shock absorber. So there you have it. Those are the membranes of bone, specifically in long bone. Okay, now we're going to look at the anatomy of flat bone, right? It's a little different. It's still got compact bone, it's still got spongy bone, but instead of house, think of it as a sandwich, right? We've got compact, then we've got spongy, and then we've got compact bone. And the reason for this is very specific. And remember when I said bone is very clever? It's very clever because the compact bone provides strength and protection. And the spongy bone is actually called diploe, and that is what's inside. And that actually has red bone marrow for hematopoiesis, etc. But the compact bone is what provides the strength and protection. And it does it in such a way that it acts like a shock absorber for the brain by distributing and reducing the impact of force. Do you ever watch any of those like CSI shows or like detective shows where you talk about blunt force trauma or whatever? That's where, it wasn't an effective shock absorber, right? That's where there was actually trauma that injured the brain. But overall, the skull has these flat bones that act as a shock absorber. And what they do is they sort of dissipate the force when there's any blunt force. And by dissipating it, it minimizes it by, it doesn't localize it to one point. So it dissipates it and absorbs that force. And so it's really quite clever and quite remarkable. So this bone is great because not only does it provide structural integrity for the skull, protection, and it's very lightweight, right? That's what that spongy part does. It makes it very lightweight. So just quite fantastic, actually, when you talk about the mechanics of bone, right? All right, let's chat about bone markings. And you might be like, well, why do I need to know about bone markings? There are so many, and yes, they are. But once you sort of know them, especially if you are taking anatomy and you actually get to feel and touch bones, you'll see that it makes sense that what they're labeled, it really does make sense. But it also helps you understand origins and insertions of muscles. So it's really important to know these. There are three classes of bone markings. First is articulations, second is projections, and third is holes. Now, articulations, this is where two bones come together, right? Articulus means joint. So this is going to be like, one surface conforming to the other, like one is rounded and the other is cupped, like a ball and socket joint, for example, and it facilitates the function of articulation. And this is also going to be where bone, muscle, and tendons attach. So much like the architecture of a house, right, bony markings are places for attachment, movement, and passage. Okay, so that was articulations. Then we've got projections. And projections are like balconies where muscles attach. So let's take a look here. We've got tuberosity, and also crest and spine would be an example of a projection. It's just a little part that sort of sticks out a little bit, right? Okay, then we've got depressions. This might be in a house like a bathtub or a sink, because what it does, it houses things, right? Or maybe ducts would be a good, a place for a duct, a vent. I don't know. Anyway, you could go crazy with the analogy. But basically, these would be like fossae or grooves, which had blood vessels and nerves. Then we've got holes or openings, right? And this would be like the foramen or the canal. Think of them as doorways or windows, I guess, is what I would say. So, there are quite a few, and you can go through all of them. But as I say, once you start learning anatomy, especially when you have a kinesthetic experience with it, when you actually have a bone in your hand and you can feel it, it all sort of makes sense. And believe me, there's a purpose for everything in anatomy. So nothing is, oh, I don't need to know that. You need to know it all because there is a purpose it serves. All right, we've talked about the anatomy and the structure and all that. What exactly is bone made of? Well, in the middle here, in the middle triangle here, we've got bone. So what bone is made of is 3 components, essentially. So the first one is collagen. Collagen is like, when you think of a house, it might be a little bit like scaffolding, but not really, because a house isn't flexible, right? Collagen gives you flexibility. That's what it does. So, it's hard to find an analogy in the house for that. The only thing I can think of is when you have like wiring in the house has flexibility, so that might be collagen. Okay, and then we've got something else, which is inorganic salts. And these are going to be like calcium phosphate, calcium carbonate, and these organic salts actually create hydroxyapatite crystals. That's what they do. And that actually creates the rigidity. It's like the concrete of the house, and it gives it its strength and durability. So the hydroxyapatite crystals give the bones the hardness and strength, but collagen fibers give them a little bit flexibility so that it's not brittle, right? So again, it might be like ducts or vents or something in the house. All right, let's get to the exciting part, which is bone cells and tissue. Now, there's so much going on here, so I'm going to sort of take it slowly. But think of bones not as lifeless structures, but as dynamic cities buzzing with activity. There's so much going on. So let's see how this city sort of operates. Let's explore it. So the first thing you want to look at is osteocytes. Now, I see them as what I call the maintenance crew. So these osteocytes are actually caretakers of the bone. They used to be osteoblasts, but they're now osteocytes. And they live in little apartments, which we call lacunae. And what they do is they maintain things, just as the name implies. They're maintenance. They maintain the bone's mineral balance. Remember that hypoxapatite? That's what it does. And it ensures that everything stays strong. They make sure everything is, working properly. Then we've got osteoblasts. And they are considered builders. They're hard-working builders that lay down new bone. Think of blast and builders. And they hang out in growing areas, which would be the periosteum, as you can see, based on that arrow. It's going to be on the outer covering of the bone. Once they've built their structure, the problem is they're not very smart when they build, right? They sort of build things from the outside in, and then they get stuck. And they get stuck in the matrix, and they can't build anymore because it's already built, and they're stuck. They're sort of paralyzed in there. And so then they retire and become osteocytes. So then they become the maintenance. They're like, okay, I've built everything. I'm retiring now. I'm too old. I'm just going to make sure everything looks good, and I'm going to maintain everything. So osteoblast and osteocyte have this sort of symbiotic relationship there. Okay, the third one is osteogenic cells, which is the green arrow that you see here. And these are what I refer to as the managers. These are stem cells, and they can divide. And they decide whether we need more builders, osteoblasts, or not. And they're going to be found deep in the periosteum and in the marrow. And they are the only bone cells that are capable of dividing, mitosis. Okay, so remember that. Okay, Lastly, we've got osteoclasts, which is the red arrow. Osteoclasts are going to be your demolition team, and I think of them as, they're sort of chomping away or chipping away at things, right? They're demolishing things because every city needs renovations, just like bone. Bone also needs renovations. So osteoclasts, what they do is they break down old bone and or damaged bone and make room for new bone. So it allows osteoblasts to come in and make. Now, the important thing here too is as they do that, they release calcium into the bloodstream as needed or when needed. So these are the four types of bone cells and tissues that you'll find in the body. And, just main thing is to have a distinction between osteoclast and blast. That's going to be really important. So I really wanted to take a deeper look at these cells, their location, function, and sort of just the relationship between each other. So as you know, osteoblasts are the builders, right? So they're going to be forming new bones, and they're obviously going to be on the ends of the bone, the epiphyseal area, where new bone is growing. They're going to be in the periosteum and the endosteum. Now, osteoblasts, what they do is they synthesize and secrete collagen matrix and calcium salts, like we talked about. And again, remember, they're not very smart, so they secrete all this in their surrounding area. They sort of build from outwards in, and then they get stuck and trapped there. But during this process, there's a change that occurs, and these cells end up becoming osteocytes, right? And they sort of get old and retire there. And then that's where they become maintenance workers, and they just make sure that everything is fine. So these are going to be located in the lacuna, which is actually going to be surrounded by bone tissue. So it's almost like they created a prison cell for themselves. Now, the osteocytes maintain mineral concentration, and they do this. They maintain the mineral concentration of the matrix by secreting enzymes. So that's how they sort of maintain and manage things. Now, like osteoblasts, osteocytes both don't have mitotic activity. They can't reproduce because osteoblasts are too young and osteocytes are retired age, past reproductive age, right? So neither of them reproduce. Now, they can communicate each other, and they do that via canaliculi. I always think of the word cannoli when I say that, so I get all tripped up. But the canaliculi are basically channels within bone that can receive communication and nutrients along these cytoplasmic processes, basically, within the matrix. So that's how they get around that. Now, you might be thinking, well, okay, if osteoblasts and osteocytes can't reproduce, then how do they get replenished when old ones die? Good question. And the answer lies in the third type of cell, which you've already met, and that would be the osteogenic cell, which is in the deep, deep layers of the periosteum. Remember, the endosteum is on the inside and the periosteum is on the outside. It's a membrane on the outside. So these cells are undifferentiated, and they, unlike osteoblasts and osteocytes, have a lot of mitotic activity. They can reproduce really fast. So these are more immature stem cells, and they can differentiate and develop into osteoblasts and then osteocytes. And that becomes osteocytes. So it's a very dynamic process, and I think that's what I wanted to convey here, that there's this relationship between all these cells, and it's very dynamic. And it basically means that new tissue is constantly formed, old, injured, or unnecessary bone is dissolved and repaired by, as you know, osteoclasts, right? And so that's going to be on the surfaces of bones, and it's basically going to reabsorb bones and demolish anything that is not functional. And in the process, it's going to release calcium, right? That would be osteoclasts. Now, osteoclasts are found, as I said, on bone surfaces. They are multinucleated, so you can see the distinction here, and they actually originate from monocytes and macrophages, which are two types of white blood cells, and they're not from osteogenic cells. So osteoblasts come from osteogenic cells, and osteocytes come from osteoblasts, but osteoclasts come from white blood cells, macrophages, and monocytes. And osteoclasts are continually breaking down old bone, and again, osteoblasts are building. So this sort of symbiotic relationship is continually forming new bone. I hope that helps. I just wanted to go into it a little bit deeper. Oh, the last thing I wanted to mention, as you see in the purple placard there, is that osteoblasts secrete a hormone too, called osteocalcin, and this helps to regulate metabolism by increasing glucose uptake in the muscles. So just a little side note. Okay, going back to our analogy of architecture, bones, there are two types, right? We've got the compact bone versus the spongy bone. The compact bone is going to be dense and strong, outer layer that bears weight and provides support. And, imagine it as steel frame of a skyscraper. And then spongy bone, on the other hand, is going to be lightweight, crisscross structure, like the Golden Gate Bridge, for example, and it's going to have this crisscross structure, but that's also what you're going to see in spongy bone, which are called trabeculae, which I'll show you in a bit. So it's kind of like cables of a suspension bridge, and it distributes weight. It's very functional, very effective, but still very light, right? So just a little visual to help you remember. All right, now we're talking about compact bone. So whenever I look at any histology of compact bone, it's so easy to remember because it's so distinct, right? Think about compact begins with a C, and the histology shows these concentric circles, which also begin with C, right? And that's how you know that this is compact bone. It's a very characteristic feature. And the structural unit of a compact bone is actually called an osteon or an Haversian system. Now let's go back to our architectural analogy, right? Just like a city needs roads and utilities to supply it, right? Bones also need a system, and that's what the Haversian system is. Blood vessels and nerves need to travel through these Haversian canals, or they're like, I don't know, underground subways, I guess, to bring nutrients and remove waste. So these pathways called Haversian canals are very important to keep the bones alive and keep everything sort of running smoothly. Now, excuse me, each osteon is composed of concentric rings and calcified matrix called lamellae, and running down each of these osteons is a central canal or Haversian canal, right, which contains blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels. Now, these vessels and nerves are very important because obviously they supply the bone. Now, they also tend to have this angling position, and they go through what we call Volkmann's canal or perforating canals. See, they sort of have this right angle. It's almost like, in a subway where you have different lines. That's how it is. And so these canals enable blood vessels and lymphatic vessels to extend to the periosteum and endosteum. That's how they do it, through these Volkmann canals. Now, remember we've talked about lamellae. Do you remember what bone cell is in lamellae? What's hanging out there? It's not osteoblasts and it's not osteogenic cells. What is it? Osteocytes. Exactly. That's what you're going to find in the lamellae area. It's actually going to be in the lacuna, which is actually the borders of adjacent lamellae. So we've got lacuna, and then there's a little sliver that's going to be the space called lacuna. And as described earlier, canaliculi connect with canaliculi of other lacunae. I cannot say that word because I think I want to keep saying cannoli, which obviously just tells you where my brain is always on desserts and food. But anyway, I digress. So this system allows everything to be connected and transported. So the osteocytes and waste can, travel and be removed. Well, the osteocytes can be transported and waste can be removed. So hope that makes sense. Okay, it's time for spongy bone. This is the cancellous bone, which contains osteocytes also, but it is housed in lacunae, which are not quite arranged in those very neat structured concentric circles. Instead, the lacunae and osteocytes are found in this lattice type network of matrix spikes that are called trabeculae. So that's the big distinction here. Now, the trabeculae may not seem as, organized or structured as those concentric circles, but, because they do look very random in their network, right? But each trabecula forms along the lines of stress to provide strength to the bone. And the spaces of the trabeculated network provide a balance to the dense and very heavy compact bone in the middle, right, in the diaphysis. So this helps make everything a little lighter and less brittle, right? In addition, the spaces, I guess, in some of the spongy bones contain red bone marrow, and this is protected by the trabeculae again, and this is also where hematopoiesis occurs. So there's the distinction between compact and spongy bone. They both have really important roles and they make everything, very strong, yet still lightweight. Okay, let's talk about blood and nerve supply now. I know we're almost there. I know this is quite a lot of information. Who would have thought bone has so much going on, right? Now, spongy bone and marrow cavity get nutrients from arteries that pass through a tiny opening, which is actually in the compact bone. Remember the diaphysis? That's where it is. It's an opening called the nutrient foramina. Now, it's right in the middle, smack dab. And these arteries bring blood to nourish the bone cells like osteocytes. And the blood flows through this marrow cavity. The veins then collect it and carry it out of the bone through the same opening. It goes through the same way. Nerves also follow the same pathway of the blood cells, or the blood vessels, into the bone. And they travel to areas, especially where, the bone is more active, obviously, right? So that, in a nutshell, is the pathway. Lastly, just a snippet about when things go wrong. What happens in conditions like Piaget? That's a psychologist. Wrong domain here. Paget's disease. This is where the demolition team we talked about, the osteoclasts, work overtime and leaving the builders, osteoblasts, struggling to keep up with them. And so this results in weak, very brittle bones that is prone to deformities and fractures, right? So that's essentially what happens when things aren't working as they're supposed to. All right. We are ready for our mind map, which is always our summary in all my videos, and this is available to download on my website. If you're interested, the link's going to be in the description. But basically, you can see we have bone structure here. We're looking at compact and spongy bone, and you can see the very distinct definition here. Compact has those concentric circles. Spongy has that matrix of trabeculae, right? And then we're also looking at the structure of where osteocytes are, what it looks like inside. That's going to give you that. And the function, compact is very dense and strong and bears weight, provides support, whereas spongy is lightweight and has this sort of crisscross structure, so it gives it that lightweightedness. And then we're also going to talk about bone cells in this mind map and show you exactly where those cells are, where they're located, and what they do. So again, it's a nice little recap and review for you. All right, thank you so much, and let me know if you have any comments, and if you found anything too difficult to understand. You know, in teaching there's this concept called muddy and clear. There are things that are clear and things that are muddy. So if there's something that's muddy, do comment and let me know, and I will either fix it or I'll create another video to explain further. Thank you once again.